Okay, class, welcome to week 13, where we'll be dealing with the title of this section is China and the Pacific Pivot, but the real focus is on the changing American and global economy in the 20th and 21st centuries. So the first reading is Deindustrialization. The effect on middle-class America. The first part of the reading talks about the changing face of American manufacturing. And it begins by telling us the 1970s. For the first time, America imported more manufactured goods than it exported. And this is because during the 1950s, 1960s, Europe was still recovering from the World War, and most of Asia was not yet industrialized, with the exception of some places like Japan and Singapore and Korea. So most of Asia was not yet producing goods on the same industrial scale as America. So Europe, which was recovering and rebuilding from the war, and Asia, which was still industrializing, both imported large amounts of American goods. As the decades wore on, the amount of goods exported did start to decline, but at the same time, America was still a major exporter. But this began to change in the 1970s. And we'll see again and again the 1970s is this sort of major turning point in the American economy. Linked to this is the ending of what they called the gold standards, the Bretton Woods Agreement. And this is the agreement that currency would be exchangeable for gold. And this was not sustainable in the face of rising inflation in the later 1960s and early 1970s. And this is a big reason why a lot of countries gave up the gold standard in the aftermath of the war. In the initial rebuilding phase, the gold standard made sense. But in the aftermath, especially with rising competition, it did not. So America, the dollar was no longer the reserve currency because it no longer had a fixed redeemable value in gold where it had before. This was essentially Nixon admitting that America had lost its position as a global exporter of manufactured goods. And the U.S. economy was moving away from manufacturing and more towards financial instruments, the sale of currency, the development of technology, that sort of thing. And the reading tells you that between 1970 and 2004, we went from almost all of the items being traded on the stock market to being manufactured goods to only about a quarter of them being manufactured goods, and more of them being corporate entities or financial instruments and that sort of thing. So this is the beginning of a loss of dominance for America and the American economy. And the exchange rates now floated rather than being calculated against the dollar, which meant that the value of currency could change more rapidly. And this led to a new type of exchange, currency exchange, where the reading here uses the example of the Swiss franc, but it's applicable toward any currency. And as another part of this, after 1970, wages began to stagnate. And increased productivity after 1970 did not improve wages as it had done in the decades before. And this next part of the reading kind of explores why that happens. And a big part of this was the rise of inflation. The rise of inflation cut into the effects of wage increases. And even in the 1970s, when workers were getting very rapid wage increases, often it was not keeping up with rising costs. It was not keeping up with inflation. Another aspect of this was the cost of oil, which was also increasing. Part of this was because the value of currencies declined, but another part of it was that America had been an oil exporter, and in the 1970s, America transitioned to an oil importer. And a lot of this was to do with two things, really. The rise of new oil markets, new emerging oil markets in the Mideast, but also to do with the declining production of the oil fields in America itself. So this next part of the reading talks about the effects of inflation on wages and productivity. And you can see the correlation here between inflation and unemployment. And you can also see that unemployment had been quite low through the 1960s, and after the 1970s, unemployment increased, and we never really have gotten back to the period of full employment we enjoyed in the 1950s and 1960s. A new term, stagflation, was coined for this development of a stagnating economy and rising prices. And the reading talks about the two types of responses. Both Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan had to choose whether to make unemployment or inflation their economic priority. And Jimmy Carter decided to focus on employment, where Ronald Reagan decided to focus on inflation. And the new economic philosophy sacrificed jobs and wages to rein in inflation, under the understanding that in the long term this would lead to a more stable economy and more jobs and better wages. This is called trickle-down economics, or sometimes Reaganomics, and it's still a core idea of the Republican economic policies. So, how did working Americans manage to survive in an age of wage decline and dropping incomes? Well, a big part of this was the emergence of double earner households. In other words, the man's effective income declined, so women entered the workforce in larger numbers to make up for that. So there were more jobs, but they were paying less, essentially. And a big part of this was women entering the workforce in bigger numbers. The changing work environment in the United States, where manufacturing gave way to intellectual manufacturing, essentially, also favored women more in the workplace. So women found more jobs that had previously been, a place where only men would have found work. We've also seen the rise of the working poor. This is people who work full time but are still considered poor in the United States, and this directly relates to the stagnation of wages and the rise of double earner households. We've also seen a massive rise in household debt. This is the amount of debt that households carry. And you can see periods of recession and how they've correlated to a rise in debt. We can see the decline in male income and the rise of female income, but note there's still a considerable difference between male and female income. The next part of the reading talks about women's role in this changing economic world and how many women found opportunities they would not have had in the previous period. The knowledge economy helped women, and even today, more women enter and complete college than men. So this trend will probably continue. At the same time, there was a need to take care of the people who could not flourish in this new economy. And this was a rise of welfare payments and social support networks. However, of course, this could be used insidiously and Ronald Reagan targeted these quote-unquote welfare queens in his speeches. So this was essentially the backlash against social services. And the next part of the reading talks about the necessity of these social services and the backlash against them. The next reading talks about the effects of automation and globalization on the American economy and American workers. And this talks about how technology was now the leading factor in economic development. And technology would lead to increased automation of the economy and also increased globalization of the economy, where work could be done cheaper in other parts of the world than it could be done in America. So this leads to, at the same time, a decline in manufacturing unemployment as there's fewer manufacturing jobs, but a rise in manufacturing output as more and more of the manufacturing is either done by automated systems or done in other parts of the world that are not America. And this gets more into the effects of these automated assembly lines and how it made workers' jobs easier, but made it a need for fewer workers, and overall led to a decline in total employment and a decline in meaningful employment, that is, employment that can pay, for all of your needs. This talks about the rise of technology and the effect on the economy and how it's made things easier, but again, it made certain jobs less necessary. And this is the rise of the tech industry, which many of you will find employment in the future. And so it's important to kind of read this and see, the changing face of the workplace. And you can see the change in financing and manufacturing profits as well. That's another part of this. And then the next part of the reading talks about the organization of modern companies and the rise of MIC jobs, or low-paying jobs, but then the potential benefits of some of these jobs, which is training opportunities. And then the next part of the reading talks about globalization, the rise of free trade agreements, and the effects of those on the global economy. So, an important reading, especially for you who are finishing your college careers and about to enter the workforce. It's important to kind of understand how this workforce has changed over the years, and especially since the 1970s. So the last reading and the activity I'll talk about in the next video, because I'm going to run out of time in this video. So stay tuned for that.